Hello, everyone, and welcome to Breast Cancer Action's webinar, Right to Try versus False Hope. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kate Frischer, and I'm the campaigns coordinator here at Breast Cancer Action, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. We are very excited to have Dr. Alison Bateman-House with us today, as well as Erica Lessem. First, a little bit of housekeeping. Breast Cancer Action doesn't take money from any corporations that profit from or contribute to the breast cancer epidemic. Our work is largely supported by individual donors like you. Please consider making a $25 donation today to support work like these educational webinars. Second, at any time during the webinar, you can ask a question by typing it into the question bar on your right-hand side. We'll save time at the end to answer as many questions as we can. Along with this, everyone except for the presenters will be muted during the webinar, and that's so we can cut down on background noise and ensure that everyone can hear well. Finally, we want everyone to get involved with Breast Cancer Action. This webinar is a great first step to do that, and please stay tuned for other ways that we'll mention later on in the webinar, as well as actions you can take. So here you can see the agenda for today's webinar. I will be giving a brief overview of Breast Cancer Action, the part that we are in right now. Then we have Dr. Alison Bateman-House, who will be talking about current access to experimental treatments, a brief overview of what is Right to Try and the FDA's role in some of these programs that give access to experimental drugs and treatments. Then we have Erica Lessem, who is providing a patient perspective and outlining some of the harms of Right to Try. She will also be giving the Take Action orientation in terms of what you can do. And then finally, like I mentioned, we will have a chance for questions and answers. However, at any point during the webinar, please feel free to submit your questions by writing into the chat box on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So I want to take a moment to talk about Breast Cancer Action, recognizing that some of you may be familiar with our work, but perhaps many of you aren't. So we were founded in 1990 in San Francisco by a group of women who were living with breast cancer, who were frustrated with the lack of information. They founded Breast Cancer Action because they saw a need for a grassroots organization with a unique understanding of the political, economic, and social context of breast cancer. Our founders, only one of whom is still alive today, knew that their private medical crises were part of a larger public health emergency, and that the experiences of those living with breast cancer needed to be heard to address this crisis. Breast Cancer Action is the only organization that addresses the breast cancer epidemic at the intersection of breast cancer, the environment, social justice, and feminism. Our mission is to achieve health justice for all women at risk of and living with breast cancer. So what does that mean, and what are some of the core values that guide our work here at Breast Cancer Action? We believe that health justice is a human right. We believe in honesty, fearlessness, and truth-telling about the breast cancer epidemic, and honoring women's diverse voices and lived experiences. We believe in putting people's health and well-being over corporate profits, and we believe in transparency and accountability for ourselves and others. We also believe very strongly that collective action can and does change the world for the better. And finally, we have freedom from conflict of interest. We recognize here at Breast Cancer Action how issues of health and social justice are intertwined throughout the work we do and form a foundation of the core values I've just explained. That's why we made a commitment to social justice as a foundation of all of our work. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what that means. So the first is that we know that breast cancer epidemic impacts communities unequally and leads to unacceptable differences in who develops breast cancer, when it develops, who gets high quality and timely treatment, and who dies from the disease. We also know that in order to address and end the breast cancer epidemic, we must tackle the root causes of these health inequities, which are often the result of a complex interplay of culture, power, economics, racism, and sexism. Similarly, we believe that no single injustice can be effectively addressed in isolation, and we recognize the way that many injustices reinforce each other on many levels and in many different ways. And finally, in our work for health justice, we strive to be an ally by using the power and privilege we hold as an organization to both build solidarity and uplift communities who currently or traditionally have had less access to power, information, and resources. So how does that look? I want to talk very briefly about some of the specific issues we work on. As the watchdog for the breast cancer movement, we have three main strategies. We educate, organize, and take action for systemic change in the following three areas. The first is our work on breast cancer screening, diagnosis, and treatment, which is really where today's webinar would fall. Our work in this area examines the data from a patient perspective and includes breast cancer screening, healthcare access, drug and device approval, and demands more effective, less costly, and less toxic treatments. The next is our work around the root causes of the breast cancer epidemic, which focuses on eliminating the involuntary exposures to hazardous and toxic chemicals present in all of our daily lives, and those exposures that put us at an increased risk of breast cancer. The last is pink ribbon marketing and culture, which often exploits a disease that devastates communities, misrepresents who is affected by breast cancer, and excludes and marginalizes women's diverse lived experiences of the disease. We address the true impact that breast cancer has on women's lives and their communities. So that is a very brief overview of what Breast Cancer Action does and who we are. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alison Bateman-House. She is an assistant professor at the Division of Medical Ethics with NYU School of Medicine and a co-chair of the Working Group on Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access. Thank you so much for being with us today, Allison.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you. I hope everyone can hear me all right. And Kate, am I able to advance the slides myself, or do you need to?
Yes, you will be.
Okay, good. So as Kate said, I'm going to talk a little bit about both the current access program, which is called Expanded Access, and then also this idea of a different legislative approach called Right to Try. And especially given the fact that Breast Cancer Action is so forthright about not taking donations from any potential conflict of interest companies or industries, I want to make it clear that I also don't take any funding from industry, but at the same time, I do have advisory relationships that are unfunded. So you can see that I work with the Janssen division of Johnson & Johnson, I work with Cytokinetics, and I work with Novartis, all of them with regard to ethical issues that come up with access to medicine. So I thought that Kate or whoever scheduled this must have been some sort of legislative guru to know exactly what was going to be happening this week to plan this webinar right when these headlines are flooding us saying that, this Right to Try bill is being pushed, there's a pushback, backroom negotiations between maybe there can be a compromise bill that will bring both the active opponents of the Right to Try bill and the active advocates together into something that will help patients. So this is a very hot moment for this topic, and things are changing very rapidly. And for all I know, by the time this webinar is over, the situation on the ground may change. But I want to at least try to give you a grounding both in what's happening legislatively and also the larger issues. So I just want to start out by saying, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many, both within industry and within advocacy groups that I have spoken to, and of course this is not a unanimous opinion, but many people would say when it deals with getting access to investigational drugs, investigational devices, investigational vaccines, whatever it is, and I'll just talk about drugs for the sake of simplicity, the best way to do that is in a clinical trial. Obviously, if we can help patients at the same time that we can gather gather data from their experiences, that will be helpful both to the patient right then and there and also future generations of patients, And then honestly, sometimes people don't benefit from being in clinical trials, but we've seen studies that say even if you are getting a standard of care treatment, or even if you're getting, in some cases, a placebo, there's still benefits that are experienced by being in a clinical trial. For instance, the sort of closer follow-up would identify the care team, would allow the care team to identify, for example, an infection earlier than might otherwise be the case. Now, this is not to say that that's always the case, and it's also not to say that there are no downsides of being in a clinical trial. There are many, and we can talk about that later. But all in all, if it's a choice between handing out drugs in an uncontrolled setting versus handing out investigational drugs in a clinical trial, my vote would be to do it in a clinical trial. And there's more reasons on the screen we can talk about during the Q&A if you wish. But the fact is, not all patients can participate in clinical trials. There are limited slots. They tend to be concentrated at large academic medical centers, which tend to be concentrated in cities, which means people in rural or less populated areas are underserved. They have to deal with the geographic barrier of either making long commutes back and forth and taking the time and the energy to do that. Also, if you are caring for, a loved one at home or children, or have a job that you're not able to take, frequent sick days from, all of these would make it difficult to participate in a clinical trial. And also, very importantly, clinical trials have enrollment criteria. So frequently, in the quest of having the most scientifically pristine data set possible, people have been ruled out of being eligible for a clinical trial, either because their past medical history or current comorbidities, or a funky lab score or something. So these are all things that are problems with clinical trials that need fixing. And also, just to note here that, of course, some people may not want to participate in a clinical trial. So for those patients who can't get into a clinical trial, even though I've just said ideally that would be the way you can get access to an experimental product, there are other options out there. So self-experimentation, particularly if you look on the internet, this is rampant. It involves things like, dietary modification, mindfulness, all sorts of things that are not necessarily evidence-based or approved to be effective for treating a disease, but people will try. There's off-label use, where you use a product that has been approved by the FDA for something completely different. So one example that is happening right now is in the multiple sclerosis committee, there's a belief that a over-the-counter antihistamine is actually helpful for MS, and so people are treating themselves with this product that they can buy at their drugstore. It is an FDA-approved product, but it was never tested for multiple sclerosis. So this is called an off-label use. Personal importation from another country. I don't actively know in the breast cancer arena if this is happening. I'd love to hear from you, but I do know in ALS, it's a common thing where people import in products from other countries. And then pre-approval access, which is what I'm going to talk about now. So what is pre-approval access? It's access to a medical product before it's approved by the FDA, hence the name pre-approval, and it's also access outside of a clinical trial. So as I said earlier, ideally, if you can participate in a clinical trial, if it works for your lifestyle and if you fit the criteria and there's eligibility for you, we would prefer you go into a clinical trial. But if you can't go into a clinical trial, that doesn't mean that we want to say, sorry, you don't get access. We want to give you access, and that is what pre-approval access is for. It's also commonly known as compassionate use, and the actual legal term of art is expanded access. And then as it notes at the bottom of the slide, there's currently an effort that I'll talk about more in a minute, Right to Try, which would be another form of pre-approval access that would exist simultaneously, contemporaneously with expanded access. They would be two separate pathways coexisting at the same time, if the bill passes. So what is expanded access? This is the current procedure by which you may use your experimental product outside of a clinical trial, and this is something that the FDA is willing to allow to happen. So what are the sort of the rules and guidelines? According to the FDA regulations, there has to be no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy to diagnose, monitor, or treat the patient's disease or condition. So some of you may recall during the Ebola epidemic of, what was it, like 2-3 years ago, a testing kit, a diagnosis, a diagnostic was rushed into use that was not approved at that point in time, simply because there was no approved rapid screen. And this is the sort of example where, something used to monitor and diagnose a disease can be used via expanded access. What we're more commonly familiar with is using experimental products to treat a disease or condition. And 2 groups are eligible. So it is either those with a life-threatening disease or condition for whom, quote, there is a reasonable likelihood that death will occur within a matter of months, or in which premature death is likely without treatment, as well as those with, quote, serious diseases and conditions associated with morbidity that has a substantial impact on day-to-day functioning. Now, serious is in the eye of the beholder. It's not a legal term, and that was used intentionally because the FDA was trying to come up with a guideline that would allow for maximum flexibility. So the example that I frequently give when talking about this category of expanded use is something like blindness. Blindness is not going to directly lead to your death or a premature death, but it's definitely a serious disease that would have substantial impact on day-to-day functioning. And so under that definition, you would be able to use an unapproved blindness drug via expanded access. The main difference between expanded access and a clinical trial is that the clinical trial's main objective is to gather data. We hope that patients will benefit from being involved in it, but we cannot promise that to happen, and nor do we even say that that is its main motive. The main motive is to gather data and hopefully to help patients along the way, with, of course, the idea being that by gathering data, we will help current and future patients. Expanded access gets rid of that idea of data collection. It simply says we are using an experimental product, yes, but we're not doing this in pursuit of scientific knowledge. We're doing this to try to treat a patient for whom there are no other treatment options available. And I don't want to go into it here, but I'll just note, as it says on the screen, you can have emergency expanded access, you can have non-emergency, you can have a expanded access protocol that deals with only one patient, you can have it deal with large patients, up to thousands of people through one protocol. And even though I'm saying that there's a distinction between research and treatment, sometimes and increasingly companies are starting to collect some sort of data from expanded access under the theory of, if we're using our investigational drug in people, even if we're not going to set up a clinical trial, maybe we should at least find out outcomes or something, simply because, what's the downside to finding out what happened to our drug in these patients? Very briefly, I'm sure everyone on the call knows this, but expanded access has existed since the 1970s, the late 1970s. It really came to the forefront of public awareness during the HIV epidemic, and then breast cancer patients took the lessons of the HIV/AIDS activists and used them, saying, we need to interact with the FDA, we need to put pressure on the FDA to make sure that it does provide some sort of access to drugs outside of clinical trials for those of us who either cannot get into the clinical trials or for whom we cannot wait until the drug is approved for general use. So there's been, modification over time since the late 70s, through the 80s, through the 90s. And in the mid to late 90s, the FDA finalized the regulations that have existed up until the last year or so, when there have been some more changes. And during that time period, there were numerous failed, well, that should say judicial and legislative efforts to change the system. So some of you may be familiar with the fact that there was something called the Abigail Alliance that sued the FDA. And I won't go into all the details of it now, but basically there's been this undercurrent of belief that, you know, from some sectors, this is certainly not a uniform belief, and it's certainly been pushed back on by others. But there was an expression of belief by some sectors saying, we just want to get the government out of having a role to play in access to investigational drugs for very sick or dying patients. So to take that on directly, I want to go through the actual process of how you participate in expanded access. And, you know, my question is, when you say get the government out, what exactly does that mean? So if I wanted to use a drug via expanded access, again, that means that I cannot get the drug that I would like to use via a clinical trial. There's no approved options for me out there. And so now I'm looking for something to try to treat myself with. First, I have to find a physician who is willing to treat me with this unapproved agent. And then in some cases, I may have to help that physician identify what a promising drug is. In other cases, the physician would be able to do that herself, but you know, in some cases, the patient does need to get involved in that. Once you have a physician on board, hopefully the physician will take ownership of the next several steps. I say hopefully because physicians are not trained in how to do any of this, and some of them may not know what to do, so may need assistance from the patient, unfortunately. In an ideal world, what would happen is once you have your physician on board and the physician knows what drug he or she wants to try to get access to for the patient, the physician would contact the company. And we can talk about that part during the Q&A if you want to. There have been efforts to try to make that easier for physicians. So once the physician contacts the company to request the drug, it's up to the drug company to say yes or no. There is no ability for any entity to overrule the drug company's decision. You can't take the drug company to court. You can't take the drug company to the FDA and say, you know, make them give me the drug. The only thing you can really do if a drug company says no is to turn to a social media campaign, which is why we've seen a number of those in the past years. After the company says yes, if the company says yes, the physician needs to contact the FDA to complete a form. And this really needs to be a joint venture between the physician and the drug company. In the case of an individual patient, it's a one-page form. There are 8 questions. It takes about 45 minutes to fill out. And the questions deal both with the history of the patient, which is why the physician is needed to be involved, the treatment plan for using that experimental agent, and also some information about the agent itself, which is why the drug company needs to be involved. The FDA reviews the form and decides whether the proposal may proceed or not. In the case of an emergency situation, that review happens same day. In fact, you don't even have to fill out the form. This can all happen over the phone. In case of a non-emergency request, you should get a response from the FDA on an average of 4 days. We know that over 99% of requests are approved by the FDA, which may lead some to say, well, it's just a rubber stamp, so why do we even need it? And the answer to that is, what we know is the request coming in and the request that's approved are not necessarily the same. The FDA input may result in changes to the treatment plan. The most common changes are changes in dosage of the drug or changes in the dosage schedule or addition of some sort of further monitoring or safety procedure. You know, for instance, saying you need to have a heart monitor on this patient while administering the drug, or you need to have, you know, anaphylactic supplies available, et cetera. So there is a value add in the review. It's not a rubber stamp. Last but not least, the physician needs to get IRB approval from his or her institution because it is an unapproved investigational drug, and then post-use serious or unexpected adverse events have to be reported to the FDA And if the company asks, they have to be reported to the company. So right to try, which I'm happy to talk about more during the Q&A, there are 3 proposals currently pending in the House of Representatives, a version already passed the Senate. And the 3 versions differ, so I don't want to try to make one monolithic claim about what it does, but more or less, it cuts the FDA out of the procedure. So as you can see, you still have to find a willing physician, you still have to identify the drug, you still have to identify the company still gets to say yes or no with no sort of, party who can force them to change their mind. You still have to get IRB approval at the institution. Perhaps it kind of depends on which version of the bill becomes law, if any becomes law. And you may still have to report serious or unexpected adverse events to the company if the company requests. What you do not have to do is you do not have to have pre-review of the treatment plan by the FDA. The FDA doesn't get to have any stake in determining whether it may proceed or not, and there's no reporting of serious or unexpected adverse event data to FDA, except for in one version of the bill, there's some carve-outs to that. It's currently law in 38 states. That really is sort of a meaningless thing because access to investigational drugs is federal, not state. So we can talk more about that during the Q&A if you want. What, if anything, passes through the House may go on to become law if it is close to what the Senate version was. The president has already said he wants to sign it. However, if it's significantly different from what passed through the Senate, the House version would have to go to the Senate for another vote. So I can't give you a guesstimate as to whether we're in the end game now or whether it's going to drag on for another year. I just don't have any idea. As I said earlier, I can't tell you exactly what the final provisions of the bill would be because 3 versions are currently in play. We do know out of the state bills that only 2 doctors in Texas have used them thus far to the best of our research ability. We haven't been able to find any other instances. I'd be happy to talk about that during the Q&A. And just to put all my cards on the table, I wrote here that I oppose the bill. I don't want anyone to be deluded into thinking this is an unbiased presentation. I try very hard to be unbiased, but of course, my opinion will filter in, and my opinion is that this is not a helpful law for patients. So just to go through very quickly, why do I oppose right to try? Well, the FDA is not the obstacle. As I said earlier, 99 plus, at least 99 point something % of requests get through the FDA, and they go through quickly, and it's a value add process. The obstacle, as far as we can tell, because this is a situation in which there are very few hard numbers, is the actual companies, because the first step that has to happen before you go to the FDA is the company has to say yes or no, and in many cases, the company says no. Now, one of my huge concerns about right to try is, as I said, it cuts the FDA out. And in my work with companies, I have been assured repeatedly that unless they know the FDA is on board with them handing out their investigational drugs to sick patients, they're not going to do it. So I honestly think that right to try as a pathway is going to see less patients getting access to drugs than expanded access. So I'm concerned that patients are being told that this is going to help them get access to drugs. I just don't see that as being true. As I said earlier, the FDA review is useful and pro-patient in that it improves that individual patient's treatment plan. It doesn't necessarily improve the treatment plan for every single patient, but estimates have been that it's around 11% of the requests get modified in response to feedback from the FDA. Another thing that's gotten very little attention is that currently under expanded access, there's a cap on what companies can charge. Basically, they can only charge the cost of their investigational drug plus a small amount of overhead to deal with shipping and other administrative costs. Right to try removes that. And so I am concerned about the fact that you would be opening the door to companies charging whatever it is they feel like charging to people who may feel like this is their only chance at a therapy, and that, you know, no matter what it costs, I've got to find a way to pay that. It opens the door to bad actors. There are currently bad actors already out there in the expanded access environment, and by not having a third-party review by someone other than the doctor and the drug company, i.e. the FDA, I feel that it opens the door for bad actors to proliferate even more than they are now. And the last thing I want to say right here is that these state laws, I said that there are 38 state laws on the books. There are some very bad provisions in those laws. I don't know if anyone's had a chance to read them, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but they say things like, if you try a drug obtained via right to try, you may end up being stripped of your ability to have health insurance. You may end up not having access to home health care, and you may end up not having access to hospice. These are obviously not things that are for the benefit of the terminally ill patient who would be attempting to use these laws. And honestly, I can't give you any justification for why these provisions are in the laws. And not every state law has these, but a number of them do. And these particular provisions are not addressed in any of the federal legislation, which I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand. Does that mean that it will still stay in effect in those states or it won't? I don't know, and I think that needs to be clarified. And then last but not least, as I said, the various laws have provisions about not reporting serious adverse effects back to the FDA. One of the laws has a carve out during which, you know, the drug company itself can ask for data to be reported to the FDA, or the Secretary of Department of Health and Human Services can declare it necessary to report it to the FDA in the name of public health. But in general, the presumption would be that these bad outcomes do not need to be reported to the FDA, which is, of course, a problem for future patients, because the FDA will be deciding whether to approve that drug for use in other patients without knowing of bad outcomes. And those bad outcomes could have been completely, you know, related to the underlying disease and have nothing whatsoever to do with the drug, or it could be related to the drug. And I think we should err on the side of having the FDA know about it. I think I'm gonna, Kate and Erica, I think I'm gonna stop right now, and we can come to a lot of this other stuff during the Q&A. Is that okay?
That's great, and thank you for being conscious of the time. I'm sorry that I've been able to see your slides and they're wonderful, but I think a lot of these questions will come up during the Q&A, so I want to leave time for it. Let me just throw up on here emails and Twitter handles for me and my team. Feel free to contact any of us if you want more info, and also to check out our webpage where we try to provide all sorts of articles and resources. Great. Thank you so much, Allison. And I agree. I can already see some of the questions that are coming in, and I'm excited for the debate that's going to ensue. So thank you again to Dr. Alison Bateman-House. That was a really wonderful and comprehensive presentation about some of the ways that patients already have access to experimental treatments, in addition to some of the risks of right to try. So I am honored and excited to introduce Erica Lessem now. She is the Deputy Executive Director of the Tuberculosis Project at the Treatment Action Group, or TAG, which is a New York-based group that does patient advocacy. So she will be speaking a little bit more about what right to try is, and specifically the dangers that right to try presents for patients. So Erica, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thanks, Kate, for the introduction, and thank you, Allison, for making my job so easy by setting this all up so thoroughly with explaining what right to try is, and why it really is just false hope and we shouldn't be supportive of it. And thank you to all the listeners who joined today. It's really great to see so many people wanting to really engage in how we can make our health system better for people who really need it. So as Kate mentioned, I work at Treatment Action Group. We are an HIV advocacy organization. We're science-based, and we're really a policy think tank that tries to find better ways to support research and access for people who are affected by HIV and also by TB and hepatitis C, which are the major co-infections of people with HIV. So even though I don't work on breast cancer specifically, I think that I can offer you guys some examples that might resonate with experiences you've had in the breast cancer community. There we go. So I'm the director of our TB project, and even though TB is an infectious disease, it's actually very similar in a way to cancer in the sense that drug-resistant TB in particular is very difficult to treat, has very poor treatment outcomes with the options that we have today. Globally, only about 50% of people who receive treatment for drug-resistant TB have a good outcome. The rest of them either die or have to discontinue treatment or remain sick for very long periods of time. And in a way, it's much like a chronic disease. It's kind of slow progressing and people stay sick with it for a really long time. So I think there are a lot of parallels with cancer there, as well as the fact that it's remained pretty elusive to find really durable cures. Most TB is curable, but these drug-resistant strains are increasingly difficult to cure and come with really bad side effects. And because resistance can develop so easily, a lot of patients wind up having drug-resistant TB and have very few treatment options to deal with it. So I'd like to start by just sharing with you a story of a patient in California who had drug-resistant TB. It took him a very long time to get diagnosed. He finally was and was referred to a brilliant doctor named Caitlin Reed. They're both pictured in the screen here if you can see it. And after struggling for a really long time, Dr. Reed finally got him on a treatment that they thought was going to be effective for him. She constructed a regimen. TB needs to be treated with multiple drugs. So there was a new drug that was recently approved by the FDA that she was able to get for him. And then there was another drug very far along in clinical development that actually had a compassionate use program or an expanded access program for it. And she tried to apply to get it for this patient, Gary. And the story is featured in the LA Times. There's the link at the bottom of the page if you're interested in reading more. What happened was Dr. Reed applied to the company that had the investigational drug that was very far in development and actually did have an expanded access program, which the FDA would have allowed the patient to receive. However, the company actually said that they didn't want to release the drug for this patient since he was on a different new drug and the two hadn't been formally studied together. Dr. Reed was conscious of the risks of doing this. Gary was conscious of the risks of taking two new medicines together that hadn't fully been tested together. But they said that they were stuck between a bad choice and a worse choice, and they wanted to do the least bad option. And it was basically, the definition, it would have been the definition of compassionate use is, okay, we don't have quite enough data to support this to go through FDA approval, but since this patient has such few options, the hope was that the company would be willing to release it. However, the company decided that they weren't going to release the drug. So I highlighted here a quote from the article which said that the company denied the application. I think this is a really important example because it shows that there are problems with patients being able to access investigational new drugs. It's not very easy to always get a drug pre-approval despite the system that's been set up. However, it is not the FDA that's the problem. It was the drug company that was the obstacle here. Gary's sister has been a really fierce advocate for him and actually submitted a testimony to the House in this past October when they were starting to consider some legislation around right to try. And this is a screenshot of her letter and then an excerpt from a part that I think is relevant for our conversation. She wrote, "Our story painfully illustrates frustrations with pre-approval access to new drugs. However, none of the barriers to access were caused by the US FDA's regulations. Rather, the issue was a company's unwillingness to provide drug." And the letter goes on to say that this kind of legislation gives drug developers full permission to charge for access to the drug. I'm editorializing here, but as Allison mentioned, the cap on charging for expanded access that the FDA currently has would be removed by this legislation. So companies would have full permission to charge for access to a drug, even one that has only been in one clinical trial of unspecified size. But it does not compel them to provide access, even for desperate cases like my brother, which is what we would have needed. So the real takeaway here is that right to try would not have helped in cases like Gary's, which I think are pretty representative of a lot of the issues that we're seeing with patients being able to access new products pre-approval or investigational products before they're approved. And I think I'm quoting from Allison here, actually, when she testified to the House in October, but right to try is a solution for the wrong problem. Patients and those who care for them do struggle to get medicines pre-approval. Gary was not able to get this drug. There was a good resolution ultimately to the story in the big picture, but not for Gary. He never got access to this drug, and he wound up having to stay on a medication that had debilitating side effects. He had painful nerve damage. He still feels pain in his feet and has numbness in his hands. And he suffered extensive lung damage because it took so long to get him cured. So his TB has, been cured, but he suffered tremendously along the way. And a lot of that could have been averted if he could have had access to this newer drug that was still under research. So there are problems for people getting medicines pre-approval. But the FDA is not the barrier. The FDA is not the problem. The FDA has mechanisms for allowing patients to access investigational drugs that Allison really clearly explained to us. And a lot of these, I think were developed or improved in response to demands by AIDS activists in the late 80s and early 90s. And that was something that the predecessors of Treatment Action Group, my organization, were very involved in. So the FDA developed a whole range of programs that could speed access to experimental therapies. And the FDA strikes a pretty good balance of, making sure that there's some evidence for safety and efficacy to protect patients, but also letting things go ahead. They approved 99.7% of the over 1,000 expanded access requests per year. So there's just a lot of evidence, anecdotally, but also in the real figures that the FDA is not the problem here. Right to try not only addresses the wrong problem, but it's completely misleading. It confers no rights to patients. It does confer a few rights to drug companies, which I think that we should all be very wary of, because like Allison said, it could really open the door to bad actors. So because the FDA approves nearly all of the requests for pre-approval access, the major barrier is not the FDA, but it's actually the decisions from the drug companies themselves. They have complete control over who can access their experimental drugs and when. And they have the right, and right to try does not change that, to deny any patient a request for basically any reason. The past legislation at the state level and on the Senate side, and the proposed legislation that we think we're going to see, does nothing to compel companies to make their products available. So it really doesn't give patients any right. It does give companies the right to make experimental products available with virtually no evidence of safety or benefit to patients. And I think this is where the potential for bad actors to comes in. We currently tend to see pre-approval access for products that have gone through some clinical trials. So there's some evidence of safety, there's some evidence that there's activity of the drug, or that the device does more or less what we think it's going to. It hasn't been fully validated in huge numbers of people at multiple locations, but there's enough to say, okay, we think that the potential benefits outweigh the potential harms. In some of the proposed legislation that we've seen, and in some of the past legislation, a drug could potentially become available if the company decides it after it's just been in 5 or 10 people in a phase 1 trial, and maybe only given a single dose, or maybe only given a couple doses of a product. So we really wouldn't know if this product would offer any potential for benefit, or if it's safe even to take in a very dire case. It also gives companies the right to charge basically whatever they want to for these products that have basically no evidence of efficacy or safety. I think I sound like I'm being a little hard on the companies here, and what I want to just put in the caveat for is that a lot of companies have legitimate reasons for not being able to provide a product pre-approval. Sometimes it's, a very small kind of startup company. They might not have resources. For example, they've only made enough drug for the clinical trial. They just don't even have enough supply of drug to meet whatever the demand might be. Or maybe they don't have enough funding or expertise in their personnel to create a pre-approval access program and figure out how to vet applications and figure out how to determine the inclusion or exclusion criteria, and even how to ship the drug to people who need it. So there are some legitimate reasons on the companies or the drug sponsor side where they might not be able to make a product available. But Right to Try also does nothing to address those challenges. So again, it's really a solution for a problem that doesn't exist. And then the problems that do exist are not getting solutions here. So I wanted to add here too just some evidence or some urging from leaders of the HIV movement, because as I noted before, a lot of the pushing for broader access pre-approval and for the pretty good tools that we have at the FDA now to do so came from the HIV movement. And even leaders of the HIV movement now are cautioning us and saying, please learn from our mistakes and don't repeat the same thing. There's a quote, there's an excellent Politico article that I linked to at the bottom here and at the end of my talk that I'd really urge people to read. And Greg Gonzalez, who was one of the early leaders of the HIV/AIDS movement and is now a professor at Yale University, said this quote here: "I remember the whole idea that there were the whole idea that there were hundreds of thousands of drugs at the FDA for AIDS, and if we could just scream loud enough or push them enough, that dam would break, and there would be this torrent of new therapeutics for people who had HIV." So there was this perception that there were a lot of drugs in the pipeline and FDA was holding all of them back, and FDA was the barrier. And then the article goes on to paraphrase Gonzalez and says, "Over time, the AIDS activists came to understand that those drugs just weren't there. Yes, there were potential therapies in the pipeline, but most of them wouldn't work, and patients weren't going to benefit from decimating the federal agency that weeds out the quality medicines from the duds." And I think that's very relevant to the discussions today, because there are huge needs, unfulfilled, unmet needs in the breast cancer community, in the TB community, in a lot of other disease areas that we're working on or concerned about. The need is real, but it's not like there are all of these drugs that could magically cure everybody, and we just need to get the FDA out of the way to get them to people. We really need the FDA, and we need clinical trials, as Allison mentioned earlier, to figure out what actually works. We do need a system to be able to have exceptions for people who can't participate in trials, and we already have that system. There is a very functional system for expanded access from the regulatory perspective. And I think where we need to be focusing efforts is really improving clinical trials, making them more flexible so that more people can participate or feel comfortable participating, and also helping to create better systems for expanded access on the supplier side to make it easier for drug companies to actually be able to make their products available, rather than blaming the FDA for a problem that really isn't theirs. So I would really urge all of you to take action to prevent this, at best ineffective and at worst very harmful legislation from going forward. Just a reminder, the Senate already passed their Right to Try legislation, I think back in August. So now that we think that there might be a bill going to the House soon, this is really our last chance to stop it. So I would urge all of you to call or to write your representative immediately and tell them to protect your health and your pocketbooks by opposing Right to Try. We need people to contact any member of the House. So, sometimes I think we hear on issues, okay, we should target the groups that aren't listening. This is an issue where everybody needs to hear it. Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, people in any state, all really need to hear opposition. This is because if there isn't perception that there's going to be opposition, when the bill is introduced, it could just go really quickly through without having to go through kind of a full analysis, if there's the chance that it would be perceived to have a large majority behind it. So we need to start making some noise now so that the members of the House can know that they don't want this bill to go through that easy option when it is introduced, that they really want to have scrutiny for it and have it go to the committees. So I've included here some information about how you can find your representative and contact them. On the next slide, there's some suggested language that you could use, and Breast Cancer Action and Treatment Action Group are going to be putting this kind of action alert out via the listservs later on. But we want people to start calling immediately, and it's a really great and easy way to engage in democracy, and a time where we really need your help to make sure this doesn't go through, because we're at the 11th hour here. We already have the Senate support. We have Trump and Pence and a lot of the Republicans pushing this. We have big money with the Goldwater Institute pushing it. And so we need to show them that patients and the people who represent them in the grassroots are stronger than that and stronger than corporate greed. So I'd really urge everybody to take action. If you're interested in learning more, here are a few resources. I think Kate is going to circulate these slides after, so don't worry about trying to copy down these long links. And please feel free to contact me. I'd love to hear from you guys. And I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to both Erica and Allison for those really exciting and incredibly informative presentations. So before we get to our questions and answers, I promise I will run through this quickly. I just want to talk about how you can get involved with Breast Cancer Action if you have been interested or inspired by today's webinar, or you found it helpful, informative in any way. Now, I certainly have. You can first become a member by signing up for a news and action e-alerts to keep up to date on the issues. I just want to plug again, I know Erica just mentioned it, we will be sending out something later this week about how you can take action in opposition of right to try. It's even easier than the slides you just saw. We send out a link that you just enter your address and you're automatically connected with your representatives. You can also join us on Facebook or Twitter, and that's another way to sort of keep up with what we're doing. This past month, we have been sharing a lot of information about right to try and what's going on in that realm. You can also help others get involved by telling your friends, coworkers, and family about this webinar and how they can take action. And finally, you can donate to support our education and advocacy work. So I will open it up to questions right now and go through them. Just one moment. So one of the questions we have, are companies petitioned for expanded access liable for harm to patients if the drug does not work?
So I guess I'll take this with the proviso, this is Allison, with the proviso that I'm not a lawyer, and a lawyer would probably do better with this question. What I do know is that a search that we did and then a separate search done by the FDA showed that there has never been a lawsuit over this situation, meaning if someone gave an investigational drug to a patient and the patient or the family did not like the outcome, or the patient died or something horrible happened, has the company, has the doctor, has the hospital, has any entity ever been sued? And two separate searches of all the various legal databases showed nothing. So one of the things that you hear when you talk to people about access to investigational drugs is a concern about litigation as a possibility. I would like to say that that is more a myth than a reality based on those web searches. It also, however, is true that just fear could be holding people back. So speaking just for myself at the moment and also for the NYU working group, we have no problem with the idea of having a liability related piece of legislation. We just want it to be good enough that it doesn't allow people to engage in any sort of egregious activity and be immune from prosecution.
Great, thank you for that answer. And I apologize, that question did come from Jean Raber. I apologize if I've mispronounced that last name. So this is a question from Mark Smith, and it's regarding, do you have any data on how frequently the drug companies agree to provide their drugs to either the patient or the physician under compassionate use?
So I guess this is for Allison again. And let me just say, hopefully you did get my email and my Twitter. I'm happy to follow up with any of these questions afterwards if I don't answer it fully during this time right now. No, we don't. What we know is we have no idea how many people ask their doctors to help them get access to investigational drugs. And we have no idea how many of those requests are rebuffed by the doctor versus how many times the doctor says, okay. We have no idea how many times a doctor contacts the drug company and asks for access. And again, we have no idea how many of those requests are rebuffed. What we do know, the only place where there's data is how many requests go into the FDA and how many requests come out of the FDA. So that's why I'm able to say with confidence that over 99% of requests are approved by the FDA, because we do have that number. However, just because the FDA approved it does not necessarily mean that the use actually happened. For instance, the patient could have died, the patient could have changed their mind, the FDA could say, you know, sure, go ahead, but have you thought about this other drug, which we actually think might be better, you know, and that would be an approved drug. So there are numerous reasons why, just because there's an FDA approval, it would not necessarily happen. So no, we don't have any concrete numbers. I will tell you, out of just the approval numbers from the FDA, we know this is not a precise number, but roughly speaking, in the last year, they got about 1,500 requests. Oh, and I should say, sorry. I should say, sorry. That number, 1,500, is request, and it's about evenly split between requests that are, you know, for a single patient, and then requests that are for a group. So a group is anywhere from, as I said earlier, 2 patients to, you know, multiple thousands. So I have no idea what the actual number of people we're talking about here is, and I don't think anyone else does either.
And
well, oh, go on.
I think this is another area where it would be really helpful to have more transparency. In fact, I know at least that for TB, when there are compassionate use requests, the companies are actually often requiring doctors to sign confidentiality agreements. So there's really not a lot of transparency here. And I think this is an area where we could actually see some legislative improvements to the process to make things a bit more clear about what's actually going on behind the scenes. But that's not being done by the existing legislation or proposed legislation.
This is Allison again. I just want to say one way that we would theoretically know how many requests happen is if the doctor had to report to the FDA, yes, we did it and there were no serious adverse events, or yes, there were serious adverse events and here's what they were, then we would have a number of how many attempts were actually carried out. But even though the doctor is supposed to report back to the FDA, that rarely happens, and the FDA doesn't have the funding or the manpower to actually audit it.
Right. Thank you both for your incredibly comprehensive answers to that question. So we have another question that I'm hoping is one for both of you, and it's regarding other supporters or opposition to this bill. So I should also mention at this point that Breast Cancer Action, I have referenced it previously, but is in opposition of Right to Try. I just wanted to, in the same vein as Allison, make that clear of our position and where we stand. But what about pharma or drug companies? How do they feel about Right to Try?
This is Allison. I'll take this one first because I've been incredibly disappointed. I speak with drug companies all the time. I know that they do not like this legislation. As I said earlier, they tell me that if the FDA is not on board with us handing out our investigational drugs, then why in the world would we do it? we're going to be coming to the FDA eventually seeking approval, and we don't want to do anything without the FDA's sign off. So I've been very disappointed in their unwillingness to say that publicly. I mean, I can understand the fact that they have a very bad reputation as an industry and are afraid of appearing even more patient unfriendly, but I think that they have a moral responsibility to say up front that we're not going to participate in this legislation if that's what I'm hearing behind closed doors. So I will say, during a hearing at the House of Representatives in October, a longtime biotech executive named Ken Mock said on the stand, during his testimony, quote, "No ethical drug company will give drug under right to try." I mean, that has been publicly reported. Janssen Pharmaceutical has changed its public policy that's available on its website to say it will only accept expanded access requests, not right to try requests. And pharma and bio both have put out statements, but the statements are very, muted and subdued. It's only by reading between the lines that you can tell that they are anti-right to try statements, because they emphasize that the FDA has a needed and vital role. But of course, they don't actually come out and say we oppose right to try.
And Erica, do you have anything? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just add again, I think Allison's answer was very comprehensive. I think it relates to what we were talking about earlier with, the concerns about liability. I think companies feel like they'd be even more exposed if they're making decisions about who to give a drug to or not without the FDA's support and consent to do so. So it would really put them further out on a limb, and I think discourage ethical companies or responsible companies from being able to do so. And also, as I mentioned in my presentation, the legislation really doesn't help them address what their barriers to pre-approval access are. And I think, a lot of companies want to be helping patients and get their products to patients who need it in a rational and, controlled way that won't harm their clinical development program or their bottom line, but they're not getting any of the support that they need to. So I think efforts would go over much better with companies if there was actually a way to kind of help take more of the responsibility from compassionate use out of their hands, actually, instead of doing what this bill would do, which is put it deeper into their hands and pockets. Right.
Well, unfortunately, we are all out of time for questions, but thank you both so much for your time and your expertise today. And thank you to everyone who is on this webinar, who attended. If we didn't have a chance to answer your question today, or you think of one later that you'd like to ask, please feel free to follow up with us. These slides will be sent out later today, along with a recording of the webinar, so you will not only have access to the slides and all of the wealth of information there, but if you want to share this, the verbal presentations will be available too. In addition, you'll be sent a short survey, just an evaluation of today's webinar, how we did. Your feedback is really vital, so we can continue to make programs like this better and better. So thank you again so much to Dr. Alison Bateman-House and Erica Lessem, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.